On the morning of November 29, 1929, a naval aviator named Thomas R. Ashford stared through the frosted window of a Ford Trimitar laboring at 11,000 feet above the polar plateau and watched the compass needle spin like a child's toy. He was 34 years old, a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, assigned as chief navigator to Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd's historic flight to the South Pole. The aircraft, a silver corrugated monoplane christened Floyd Bennett, carried 4 men. Byrd, the expedition commander, Bernd Balchen, the Norwegian pilot, Harold June, the radio operator, and Ashford, whose official role was to confirm Byrd's sextant readings and keep the dead reckoning plot. He had been chosen for the flight because his navigation was considered impeccable and his discretion absolute. That discretion was now being tested by something he had no framework to explain. The magnetic compass was useless. The radio compass had begun emitting a low, pulsating tone that June could not shut off. The outside air temperature, which should have been 40 below zero, was reading a steady 62 degrees Fahrenheit. And beyond the glacier-scoured peaks of the Queen Maud Range, in the direction of the pole, a greenish luminescence was staining the undersides of the clouds, as if the ice itself were glowing from within. Ashford turned from the window and caught Byrd's eye. The Admiral was seated forward, his face unreadable behind a leather flying mask, but his hand rested on a sealed leather attaché case that Ashford had never seen him open. When Ashford gestured to the instruments, Byrd leaned over and said, in a voice calm enough to be terrifying, "We are entering a region that does not appear on official charts. Continue logging position. Record everything. This will not be in the expedition report." Ashford opened his personal navigation log, a small oilskin-bound book he had purchased with his own money, and wrote the time, the altitude, the impossible temperature, in a single sentence. "We have crossed a boundary. The Earth below is no longer what the Admiralty charts describe." He did not know then that his log would be read aloud exactly once, 18 years later, in a closed room at the United States Naval Academy, before being sealed under classification so strict that no living archivist will acknowledge its existence. What Thomas Ashford recorded in that oilskin log across the next 4 hours is not a matter of public record. The official narrative of the Byrd polar flight, published by the National Geographic Society and taught in American classrooms for a century, describes a triumphant out and back journey. 4 men flew to the South Pole and returned, the first to do so by air, and they saw nothing but ice and snow. The logbooks of Balchen, June, and Byrd himself were deposited in the Library of Congress and the Ohio State University archives. They are available for inspection. Ashford's log is not. The Navy acknowledges no such document. The Naval Academy archives contain no file under his name, but a transcript of a 1947 hearing, preserved in the private collection of a retired naval historian in Annapolis, records that a Lieutenant Commander Ashford, Tr. retired, was invited to present certain navigational anomalies from the 1929 polar flight to a closed subcommittee of the Academy's senior faculty. That hearing lasted 6 hours. At its conclusion, the transcript states, all materials were collected, classified, and placed in a vault designated only by a number. The subcommittee issued no finding. Ashford left the Academy, returned to his home in Maine, and died of a heart attack 3 weeks later. This is the story of what that log contained, why Admiral Byrd never spoke of it, and what the Navigator saw on the far side of the South Pole that the keepers of the official record have spent nearly a century ensuring you do not hear. I need to tell you something plainly. Stories like this one survive because a few people refuse to let them die. The naval officer who kept the transcript, the historian who preserved it, the researcher who found it and passed it to me. Each of them made a choice. The algorithm will not reward that choice. It rewards speed, brevity, and the soft confirmation of what you already believe. This channel exists outside that economy. If you understand the value of what I am describing, take a moment now and subscribe. Share this video with one person who needs to hear it. Then we go to the ice. Thomas Redding Ashford was born in 1895 in the coastal town of Rockport, Maine, the son of a ship's chandler who outfitted schooners for the North Atlantic trade. He entered the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1913, graduated with the class of 1917, and was commissioned as an ensign just as the United States entered the First World War. He served aboard the battleship USS Delaware, escorting convoys through the U-boat lanes of the North Atlantic, and afterward transferred to the Navy's emerging aviation branch. By 1927, he had qualified as a naval aviation observer and navigator, specializing in celestial navigation and dead reckoning over open water. His service record, which I have obtained from the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis, describes him in the clipped language of Navy evaluations: exceptional judgment under pressure, unusually precise in log keeping, recommended for classified assignment. That last phrase is worth noting. Ashford was not merely a skilled navigator. He was a man the Navy trusted to keep records that would not be read by the public. In the spring of 1928, he was detached from his squadron and assigned to the Byrd Antarctic Expedition, a nominally private venture funded by the National Geographic Society, the New York Times, and a consortium of wealthy industrialists, including John D. Rockefeller Jr. and Edsel Ford. Byrd, already a national hero for his disputed flight over the North Pole in 1926, had organized the expedition to establish a base on the Ross Ice Shelf, conduct geological and meteorological research, and attempt the first aerial crossing of the South Pole. The expedition's official scientific staff included geologists, biologists, and meteorologists from a dozen American universities. Ashford was listed as Navigator and Cartographic Officer. The base camp, called Little America, was constructed on the Bay of Whales in January 1929. It housed 42 men, 3 aircraft, and a radio station that maintained a link to the outside world via a relay ship in the Ross Sea. Ashford spent the austral winter of 1929 calibrating instruments, training with the Fairchild and Fokker aircraft the expedition had brought, and preparing the navigation charts for the polar flight. He worked closely with Byrd, whom he grew to respect but also to question. Byrd was an immensely capable organizer, but also an intensely guarded man, and Ashford noticed that certain maps and charts were kept in a locked strongbox in Byrd's quarters, never shown to the scientific staff. When Ashford asked what they contained, Byrd told him they were contingency charts and changed the subject. The flight to the pole was scheduled for late November, when the austral summer provided continuous daylight and the most stable weather. The aircraft selected was a Ford Trimitar, registration NX 4542, named for Floyd Bennett, the pilot who had accompanied Byrd to the North Pole and had died of pneumonia the previous year. The machine was a rugged, high-wing monoplane powered by 3 Wright Whirlwind radial engines. It had been modified for polar conditions with skis, extra fuel tanks, and a cabin stripped of every ounce of unnecessary weight. The navigation suite included a Pioneer magnetic compass, an early radio direction finder, a drift indicator, and a bubble sextant. Ashford would be responsible for maintaining the dead reckoning plot, cross-checking celestial fixes, and recording all navigational data in his personal log. He also carried a small camera, loaded with nitrate film, that he would later claim was confiscated. On the night of November 28th, with the weather window open and the barometer steady, Byrd gave the order. The crew boarded the Floyd Bennett at 3 in the morning. The engines were warmed. At 3:29 a.m., the Trimitar lifted off from the ice runway, climbed slowly into the polar twilight, and turned south. Thomas Ashford opened his logbook and wrote the first entry. Departed Little America, course 180 degrees true, altitude 2,000 feet, visibility unlimited, all instruments nominal. The trigger event had begun. For the first 4 hours, the flight was uneventful. The Trimitar droned over the Ross Ice Shelf, a featureless white plain broken only by the occasional crevasse. Ashford plotted their position using a combination of dead reckoning and sunshots, and found that the plane was making good time. At mile 200, they crossed the foothills of the Queen Maud Range, a jagged wall of ice-sheathed peaks that rose to over 12,000 feet. Balchin coaxed the overloaded aircraft upward, nursing it through a narrow pass that Byrd had scouted by dog sled the previous year. Ashford recorded the passage in his log. Mile 245, cross divide at 11,400 feet, conditions clear. Magnetic compass beginning to deviate. By mile 350, the deviation had become impossible to ignore. The magnetic compass was swinging through an arc of 40 degrees, unresponsive to the compensating magnets. The radio direction finder, which should have been receiving a steady signal from the Little America beacon, was emitting a high-pitched whine that June could not silence, no matter how many frequencies he tried. Ashford looked to Byrd. Byrd's expression, he later noted in his log, was one of concentrated expectation, a man watching a known sequence unfold. He did not look surprised. At mile 400, the outside air temperature, which had been a bitter 40 degrees below zero, began to climb. By mile 420, it had reached zero. By mile 440, it was 25 degrees above. Ashford checked the thermometer repeatedly, convinced it was malfunctioning. The engines, however, confirmed the change. Balchin reported that the carburetors were responding to a warmer, denser air mass, and he had to adjust the mixture. Ashford logged it. Temperature inversion of magnitude not explicable by Fein effect. OAT now 30 degrees Fahrenheit and rising. The ice below appears to be thinning. At mile 475, they crossed the calculated position of the pole. Byrd circled the aircraft and the crew exchanged congratulations. But Ashford noticed that the Admiral's attention was fixed not on the instruments, but on the horizon ahead. There, Byrd said, pointing. Do you see it? Ashford looked. Beyond the pole, in a direction that should have led to nothing but the empty interior of the Antarctic plateau, the ice was broken by a broad, dark band that glittered in the low sun. It was water. Open water, stretching for miles, its surface lapping against the edge of the ice shelf. And beyond the water, rising from the surface like a black tooth, was a massive structure of polished stone that Ashford estimated to be at least 1,000 feet high. The smoke or mist that clung to its summit was not natural cloud. It was too still. It glowed faintly, a sourceless green luminescence that pulsed in a slow rhythm. Ashford reached for his camera. Byrd's hand clamped down on his wrist. Not yet, the Admiral said. Log the position. Log everything. But we do not photograph until I say so. Ashford noted the time, 10:14 a.m. He wrote the coordinates, latitude 90 degrees 02 foot south, approximate longitude 175 degrees east. And then he wrote, black structure, cylindrical, rising from ice-free water. Surface appears worked, polished. Green luminescence at summit. The structure is not a natural feature. I do not know what we are looking at. The inciting incident had reached its point of no return. Byrd ordered Balchin to descend to 4,000 feet and circle the structure. What followed, across the next 2 hours of flight, was a sequence of observations that Ashford recorded in his log with the meticulous horror of a man documenting his own disbelief. I am working from a transcript made during the 1947 Annapolis hearing, which was read aloud by Ashford himself, and I will describe what he described. The first mini-revelation was the geometry. As Balchin banked the forward trimeter into a wide circle, Ashford could see that the black cylinder was not an isolated monolith. It was the central spire of a vast complex of geometric walls and terraces, laid out in a radial pattern that looked, from the air, like an 11-pointed star inscribed on the surface of the Earth. The outer walls were half buried in ice, but their outlines were unmistakably artificial, straight lines meeting at precise angles, their surfaces reflecting the sun with the gloss of polished obsidian. Ashford sketched the layout in his log, noting that the star's points aligned with the cardinal and subcardinal directions and that the central spire appeared to be the same polished black stone they had seen on approach, shot through with veins of a silver-colored metal that glittered in the light. He wrote, "The plan is architectural, not military. This is not a fortification. It is a ceremonial center, or a marker." The second mini-revelation was thermal. At a distance of 1 mile from the central spire, the outside air temperature had climbed to 58 degrees Fahrenheit. The ice below the structure was visibly melting, feeding the open water they had seen. Balchin reported that the aircraft's engines were running smoothly, but the cockpit had become uncomfortably warm, and the odor of ozone was strong, like the air after a lightning strike. But continuous, Ashford wrote. He checked the magnetic compass again. The needle was now spinning continuously, a full rotation every 2 seconds. The radio whine had resolved into a steady, low-frequency hum that June said was almost like a carrier wave, but on no frequency I've ever seen. The third mini-revelation came when they crossed directly over the central spire. The structure's summit was a flat platform, and on that platform, visible through the mist, was a single circular aperture, a shaft descending into the interior. The green luminescence was emanating from that shaft, pulsing at a rate that Ashford timed with his watch, 11 pulses per minute. He wrote, "The light does not scatter like incandescence. It is coherent, like a beam, and it appears to be directed upward. The summit platform is ringed with a low parapet, and on the parapet are mounted objects that resemble mirrors or lenses, angled toward the aperture. The entire arrangement suggests a signaling device or a weapon." The fourth mini-revelation was biological. As they circled lower, Ashford could see that the terraces around the spire were not barren. Dark green vegetation, moss, or something like moss, covered the stone in thick mats. On the largest terrace, at the base of the spire, there was movement. Shapes. Ashford pressed his face to the cabin window and saw, for a span of perhaps 10 seconds, a line of figures emerging from an archway in the spire's flank. They were humanoid, upright, dressed in what appeared to be close-fitting garments of a dark material, and they were looking up at the aircraft. One of them raised an arm. Ashford could not tell if the gesture was a greeting or a warning. He called to Byrd. Byrd looked down, his face pale, and said only, "They are not hostile. They are observers." He did not explain how he knew. The fifth mini-revelation came through the radio. Harold June, who had been trying without success to raise Little America on the standard frequency, suddenly stiffened in his seat. He turned to Byrd and said, in a voice that Ashford later described as shaken to the core, that he was receiving a signal on a frequency the set should not have been able to receive, a voice. Speaking English with an accent June could not place, repeating a single sentence, "The gateway is observed. The circuit recognizes the visitor. Do not descend below 2,000 feet. The resonance is not safe for your craft." June asked if he should reply. Byrd shook his head. "Log it," he said. "Do not transmit." Ashford wrote the words down verbatim. They are in the transcript. The sixth mini-revelation was cartographic. Ashford had been attempting to fix their position by dead reckoning, but the terrain below did not match any map he had ever studied. The open water extended far to the north, and beyond it he could see, through a break in the mist, a chain of mountains that were not on the expedition's charts. Mountains whose flanks were green with forests, whose summits were bare rock, and across whose lower slopes wound what appeared to be a road. A road of cut stone, switchbacking up from the water's edge. He sketched it in his log, the pencil trembling in his fingers. "We are looking at a temperate, inhabited landscape beyond the South Pole," he wrote. "If I am hallucinating, then the instruments are hallucinating too. The magnetometer is off scale. The thermometer reads 61 degrees. The vegetation is visible to all 4 crew members. This is not a mirage." At that point, Byrd ordered Balchin to turn the aircraft north. He did not say why. He did not say what he had seen. He only said that they had reached the limit of their fuel reserve and must return. But Ashford noted that the Admiral's attaché case was now open on his lap, and inside it he could see a document covered in symbols, the same 11-pointed star, the same wheel within a wheel, the same script that looked like no alphabet Ashford recognized. Byrd caught him looking, snapped the case shut, and said quietly, "You have done your duty, Commander. You will submit your log to me upon landing. I will decide what becomes of it." Ashford said nothing. He closed the log, tucked it inside his flight jacket, and began to calculate the course home. The Floyd Bennett landed at Little America at 7:10 p.m. on November 29th, after a flight of nearly 16 hours. The official reception was jubilant. Photographs were taken. Telegrams were sent. Byrd gave a brief statement to the press officer, declaring that the pole had been reached and that the continent was a vast, lifeless ice sheet. Thomas Ashford shook the Admiral's hand for the cameras, then walked to his quarters, locked the door, and spent the night writing out a complete, detailed account of everything he had seen. Separate from the abbreviated log, he would eventually surrender. He expected Byrd to confiscate his personal log. Byrd did not ask for it. Instead, 2 days later, a radio man named Paul Seipel, who would later become a prominent Antarctic scientist, approached Ashford with a message from Washington. The Navy Department, Seipel said, had been informed of unusual observations on the flight. Ashford was to consider himself bound by the security provisions of the Espionage Act. He was not to discuss the flight with anyone outside the expedition's senior staff. He was not to publish, lecture, or correspond about what he had seen. His personal log was to be placed in a sealed envelope and delivered to the captain of the expedition's supply ship, the SS Eleanor Bolling, for transport to the Navy Department. Ashford complied. He surrendered a logbook. But it was not the real logbook. The real logbook, the oilskin volume he had purchased with his own money, he kept hidden in the lining of his sea bag. Ashford returned to the United States in April 1930. He was promoted to commander, assigned to shore duty at the Hydrographic Office in Suitland, Maryland, and never spoke of the polar flight to anyone outside the service. He watched as Byrd became a national hero, as the official narrative of the expedition was published and celebrated, as the anomalous readings and the green luminescence and the black city beyond the pole were erased from the collective memory of the nation. He did not protest. He waited. In 1947, 17 years after the flight, Ashford was contacted by an old Annapolis classmate who had risen to the rank of Rear Admiral and served on the Academy's senior faculty. The classmate, whose name is redacted in the hearing transcript, told him that certain questions about the 1929 flight had resurfaced in connection with Byrd's recent Operation High Jump, the massive naval expedition to Antarctica that had returned under mysterious circumstances the previous year. Would Ashford be willing to present his original navigation log to a closed subcommittee of Academy faculty and senior Navy intelligence officers? Ashford agreed. He traveled to Annapolis with the oilskin logbook in his briefcase and spent 6 hours reading aloud, page by page, the full account of what he had seen beyond the South Pole. The hearing transcript records the moment Ashford reached the description of the central spire and the figures on the terrace. An unnamed officer interrupted him and asked, "Are you absolutely certain of what you saw, Commander?" Ashford replied, "I am a trained naval observer. I logged the bearing, the altitude, the temperature, the radio transmission, and the presence of 4 independent witnesses. You may accept my account or dismiss it, but you may not claim I was uncertain." The room fell silent. The transcript notes, Commander Ashford's demeanor was steady and his testimony unshaken under cross-examination. The subcommittee recommends that the log be retained under the highest classification and that Commander Ashford be reminded of his continuing obligations under the Espionage Act. The hearing concluded. The log was placed in a vault at the Academy's Nimitz Library, where it remains, catalogued under a number that does not appear in any public finding aid. Ashford returned to his home in Rockport, Maine, and died of a heart attack on December 17, 1947. He was 52. His daughter later found a note in his desk drawer that read, "The city is still there. The ice is not the end. The ice is the seal." The suppression of Thomas Ashford's log follows a pattern that, if you have studied the buried history of the polar regions, you will recognize immediately. Admiral Byrd himself was increasingly circumspect about Antarctica in the years after the 1929 flight. In a 1954 interview with the Argentine newspaper La Razón, he stated that the United States should maintain a close watch over the lands beyond the pole because those lands held resources of incalculable value and a potential threat to global security. He elaborated no further. His death in 1957, at the age of 68, was attributed to a heart ailment. His personal papers, donated to the Ohio State University, contain no reference to the 1929 anomalies, though archivists have noted that the collection includes a sealed box not scheduled for review until 2029. Bernd Balchen, the pilot, lived until 1973 and became a decorated Air Force officer. He wrote a memoir titled Come North With Me, in which he described the polar flight in technical detail but made no mention of a black structure, open water, or radio transmissions. In a 1968 interview with a Norwegian journalist, however, he was asked directly whether Byrd's expedition had seen anything unusual over the pole. Balchen paused for a long moment, then said, "What we saw is not in the books, and it will not be in the books until the books are rewritten." He refused to elaborate further. Harold June, the radio operator, died in 1962. His personal logbook, donated to the San Diego Air and Space Museum, contains a single ambiguous entry for the date of the polar flight. Transmissions received on anomalous frequency. Contents logged separately and submitted to command. The separate log has never been located. The transcript of the 1947 Annapolis hearing survived because the retired naval historian I mentioned, a man named Commander Ellis Drummond, was present as a junior stenographer and made a carbon copy of the proceedings without authorization. Drummond kept the copy in his private papers, which his grandson discovered in 2006 and made available to a small circle of independent researchers. I have seen the copy. The pages are typewritten on Navy letterhead, watermarked 1946, and they bear the faded signatures of the subcommittee members. The text matches no other known document, but the style is consistent with official Navy hearing transcripts of the period and the details it contains, the names, the dates. The technical terminology are accurate in ways that would be difficult for a forger to fabricate. The broader context is this: Operation High Jump, Byrd's 1946-47 naval expedition to Antarctica, involved 13 ships, 33 aircraft, and 4,700 men. Its official mission was to test cold-weather equipment and assert American territorial claims. But the expedition returned 8 weeks earlier than planned, and Byrd gave a press conference in which he stated that the United States should prepare for the possibility of hostile planes coming from the polar regions. This statement, widely reported at the time, was never explained. A number of researchers, including the late John G. Fuller and the independent historian Joseph P. Farrell, have argued that High Jump encountered something in Antarctica that the Navy was not prepared to engage, something that may have been related to what Ashford and his crewmates saw in 1929. The Ashford log, if it is ever released, would confirm or refute that connection. The Navy has thus far declined to release it. In 2018, a Freedom of Information Act request was filed with the Naval History and Heritage Command for all records pertaining to Lieutenant Commander Thomas R. Ashford and the 1947 Annapolis subcommittee hearing. The response, received after a 2-year delay, stated that no records responsive to the request could be located. This is consistent with the pattern we have seen across dozens of similar inquiries. The records exist, they are cataloged, and they are withheld, while the official reply maintains the fiction that they never existed at all. The Black City beyond the pole is still there, if Thomas Ashford's eyes and instruments were not lying. The central spire is still humming, its green luminescence pulsing at 11 beats per minute, the figures on its terraces still watching the sky for visitors who know what they are looking for. The logbook that recorded the exact coordinates is sitting in a vault at the United States Naval Academy, a few hundred yards from where midshipmen study navigation by the same stars Ashford used, learning nothing of the lands that lie beyond the ice. The 4 men who flew the Floyd Bennett on November 29, 1929 took what they saw to their graves, or to classified graves, and the world was handed a story of triumph and emptiness that has never been corrected. The ice is not the end. The ice is the seal. The official record is missing chapters. The only way those chapters get written is if enough of us refuse to stop asking. Share this video with one person tonight. Tell them there is a logbook in Annapolis that no one is allowed to read, and that it contains a map of a place we were never supposed to know existed. Until the seal breaks, keep watching the sky. Keep asking. The city is still there. Ignatieff, a rational man of the 19th century, did not accept this explanation, but he noted it. He noted everything. The 5th mini-revelation was cartographic. By September 12th, Ignatieff had taken enough bearings from elevated points along the wall to project its line onto his survey chart. The wall ran east-northeast, as he had measured. But when he extended that line backward, to the west-southwest, he found that it intersected a series of other anomalies that he had not previously connected. A reported black ridge in the Altai foothills, documented by a Russian mining engineer in 1857. A description of a ruined stone barrier in the Darim Basin, recorded by the British explorer William Moorcroft in 1820. A location in the Hindu Kush where a Persian geographer of the 11th century had described a wall of polished black stone, built by the Jinn before the time of Adam. All of these points lay on the same great circle bearing. Ignatieff was not looking at a local structure. He was looking at a segment of a transcontinental alignment, a line that stretched from the deserts of western China to the mountains of Afghanistan and possibly far beyond. He wrote, in a marginal note that he later underlined twice, "If this wall is continuous, it is the largest single construction on the face of the earth, and we have no record of who built it." The sixth and final mini-revelation came on September 14th, the last day the expedition could afford to stay before their water ran out. At Test Pit 11, Ignatiev uncovered a section of the wall that was not a wall at all. It was a doorway. A vertical seam ran from the base of the exposed stone to its crest, perfectly straight, and when Ignatiev inserted a chisel into the seam and levered gently, a slab of the black stone swung inward on invisible hinges. Beyond it was darkness, a passage descending at a shallow angle into the earth. The air that emerged was warm and dry and carried a faint scent Ignatiev could only compare to burnt metal. Dorji refused to enter. Vyrobov, after a moment's hesitation, lit a lantern and followed Ignatiev inside. The passage walls were lined with the same polished stone, but here the silver veining was more abundant, glowing faintly in response to the lantern light. They advanced for what Ignatiev estimated was 300 yards. Then the passage opened into a circular chamber. The chamber was a perfect hemisphere, perhaps 40 feet in diameter, its domed ceiling lost in shadow above the reach of the lantern. The floor was a single slab of black stone, polished to the same mirror finish, and at its center stood a cylindrical plinth of the same material, roughly 5 feet in height. Embedded in the top of the plinth was a horizontal disc of the silver-white alloy, and set into that disc, like a needle on a compass, was a thin rod of the same metal that pointed unerringly toward one section of the curved wall. The wall opposite the plinth was covered in a carved relief, a map. But it was not a map of any world Ignatiev recognized. The map showed a continent that combined features of Asia, Europe, and Africa into a single landmass, but the coastlines were wrong. The Mediterranean was a broad inland lake connected to the Atlantic by a wide, shallow strait that did not correspond to Gibraltar. The Black Sea was a deep bay opening northward into a vast, ice-covered ocean. The Indian subcontinent was attached to Antarctica by a land bridge that no longer exists. And across the entire surface of the map, radiating from a central point that Ignatiev estimated to be somewhere in the Gobi Desert itself, were engraved lines, the same great circle alignments he had been tracing on his own survey chart. The lines connected to symbols at their termini, an 11-pointed star here, a wheel within a wheel there. A pyramid-shaped glyph at a point that Ignatiev later calculated corresponded to the location of the Great Pyramid of Giza. Vyrobov swore softly. Ignatiev said nothing. He walked the perimeter of the chamber, sketching the map as well as he could by lantern light. At the point on the map that corresponded to their current location, there was a single engraved symbol, an 11-pointed star enclosing a circle, the same symbol they had found carved on the wall's exterior. And beneath it, in characters that Ignatiev did not recognize, but which Vyrobov tentatively identified as resembling the old Turkic runes found on the Orkhon inscriptions, was a line of text. Vyrobov translated it haltingly, his voice barely a whisper. "The gatherers mark this gate. The circuit is whole. When the ice returns, seal the knowledge and withdraw." Ignatiev reached out and touched the silver needle on the plinth. The moment his fingers made contact, the needle swung smoothly and pointed directly at him. The blue luminescence they had seen on the exterior wall flared along the silver veins of the chamber, and the humming note rose in pitch, filling the space with a sound like a vast choir holding a single chord. And a voice spoke. It did not come from the walls or from the air. It formed directly inside Ignatiev's skull, in Russian, in words that were calm and precise and utterly alien. "You stand at the 44th meridian. The walls remain because the resonance must be preserved. You are not the first to enter. You are not the first to forget. When your maps are burned, remember the sound. The sound will bring you back." Then the light died. The voice ceased. The hum dropped to its low, steady G. Ignatiev withdrew his hand, as if burned. Vyrobov, pale and trembling, grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the passage. They ran. They burst out into the cold Gobi dawn, and Ignatiev ordered the pit to be backfilled immediately. The doorway was covered with sand and gravel within the hour. He wrote nothing about the chamber in the official log. But in his private field notes, he recorded every detail: the map, the alignments, the plinth, the voice, the words. And then he ordered the expedition to break camp and ride north. The expedition returned to Kayakta on October 29, 1881. 3 of the 6 men who had ridden out were still alive. Anton Virabov died of what Ignatiev described in his report as typhus on the return journey. But Dorji later told a friend in Urga that Virabov had simply stopped eating and talking after they left the wall, and had died 2 weeks later with a blank expression and a fever no medicine could touch. The Cossack Mikhail Orlov deserted the party before they reached the Russian border and was never heard from again. The cook Ali Khan remained in Mongolia. Only Ignatiev, Dorji, and Fyodor Krivtsov returned to Russian territory intact. Ignatiev submitted his official report to the Society's Council in early 1882. It contained the standard geological and meteorological observations and no mention of the wall. But he had also prepared a second document, a full, unredacted account of the discovery, accompanied by his sketches and measurements, and had submitted it privately to Simonov Tenshansky, the Society's director. He hoped that the director, an explorer of great vision, would recognize the significance of the find and authorize a second, larger expedition to excavate the wall properly. Instead, Simonov summoned him to his office and told him, in a conversation Ignatiev later reconstructed for Dorji, that the matter was too sensitive for publication. The Society's relationship with the Qing government was delicate. The wall, if it existed, lay in territory claimed by China, and any suggestion that a pre-Chinese civilization had built massive structures within China's sphere of influence would provoke a diplomatic incident. The Tsar's government could not afford such complications. The field notes were to be surrendered. The discovery was to be forgotten. Ignatiev refused to surrender the notes. He was dismissed from the Society's service within a month, his pension revoked, his reputation quietly smeared as a man who had succumbed to desert delusions. He returned to Tver and lived in poverty, working as a tutor of geography. The Society's official expedition report, published in 1883, edited by Simonov himself, contained no reference to the wall. The unredacted field notes were removed from the archives by an assistant librarian named Ilya Glinka, who had been ordered to destroy them but instead made photographic copies using a cyanotype process he had learned from a visiting French archivist. Glinka hid the copies in a hollowed book and, in 1895, passed them to a Finnish geographer named Oskar Nordinskiold, who was visiting St. Petersburg for a conference. The copies ended up in Helsinki, where they remained in the Nordinskiold family papers until 1962, when a researcher named Martti Räsänen found them and recognized their significance. Räsänen attempted to interest the University of Helsinki's geography department in the material. He was told the notes were interesting but unverifiable. He wrote to the Soviet Academy of Sciences in 1964, requesting access to the original Ignatiev papers. He received no reply. He wrote again in 1966. Again, silence. In 1968, Räsänen's apartment was burglarized, and a folder containing his Ignatiev research notes was the only item taken. He abandoned the project. He died in 1987. The cyanotype copies remain in the possession of his grandson, who has allowed me to view them under condition of anonymity. The wall itself has been detected, though never officially acknowledged. In 1992, a joint Mongolian-Russian geological survey, using ground-penetrating radar along a transect in the eastern Gobi, recorded a linear subsurface anomaly extending for over 300 kilometers at a bearing of 73 degrees. The survey report, published in a minor geological bulletin, attributed the anomaly to a fault zone. No follow-up survey was conducted. In 2006, a private researcher using declassified Cold War satellite imagery identified what she described as a continuous linear feature, possibly of artificial origin, crossing the Gobi from the Altai foothills to the Kongai Range. She submitted her findings to the Mongolian Academy of Sciences. She received a formal acknowledgement and no further communication. Dorji Tsibikov returned to his village in the Transbaikal region and lived quietly until his death in 1919. He told his son that the wall had been built by the people before the flood, who knew the names of the stars and how to make stones sing. He also said that Ignatiev had told him, on their last night together in Kayakta, that the voice in the chamber had given him a warning he did not fully understand. The ice will return. The walls must hold. When the circuit breaks, the forgetting ends. Ignatiev himself died of pneumonia in Tver in 1901. He was 59. On his deathbed, he told his sister that the humming note from the Gobi was still sounding in his ears and had not stopped for 20 years. He asked her to bury his field compass with him. She did. The wall is still there. It runs for 600 kilometers under the sand, a black line of polished stone aligned to a bearing of 73 degrees, humming at a frequency that no instrument has been allowed to measure. The map chamber, with its impossible coastlines and its silver needle, is still there, sealed under the gravel that Ignatiev's men shoveled back into the pit on a September morning in 1881. The voice that spoke inside his skull has not been recorded by any second witness, but the cyanotype copies of his field notes are real. I have held them. The sketches are precise. The measurements are consistent. The symbol of the wheel within the wheel, enclosed in the 11-pointed star, appears on every page that documents the wall. Whatever built that structure, it was not the Han, it was not the Qin, and it was not any civilization the textbooks are willing to name. It was something older, something that mapped the world before the last ice sheets melted, something that left a circuit of resonant stone across the spine of Asia, and then withdrew, leaving behind instructions to seal the knowledge when the ice returned. The ice did return. The knowledge was sealed. The forgetting was almost complete, but not quite. The official record is missing chapters. The only way those chapters get written is if enough of us refuse to stop asking. Share this video with one person tonight. The algorithm will not preserve this story. You will. Until then, listen for the hum. It is still sounding, under the sand, at the 44th meridian, waiting for the circuit to break and the forgetting to end.